Emperor Saga sat on the chrysanthemum throne in 809 CE and immediately did something that shocked even his own court. He reduced the imperial harem from over 200 women to barely 50. The noble families who had spent fortunes placing their daughters in the palace were furious. They demanded explanations. They got silence. What they didn't know yet was that Saga hadn't reduced his collection of concubines. He had simply changed their gender. Within 6 months of taking power, Emperor Saga had assembled a private collection of over 80 young males between the ages of 12 and 16. These weren't servants. They weren't pages or attendants in any traditional sense. They were chigo, imperial favorites, and they lived in specially constructed quarters adjacent to the emperor's private chambers. Court records from the period, which were hidden for over 1,000 years, describe these boys with the same language previously used for female concubines: their beauty, their grace, their value. The practice wasn't new. Male favorites had existed in various forms throughout Japanese history. But Saga institutionalized it. He created official positions, allocated budgets, established protocols. He turned what had been whispered about into something the court had to publicly acknowledge while pretending not to see. Saga's chief advisor, Fujiwara no Fuyutsugu, kept meticulous records that survived in a sealed archive. The documents described the emperor's daily routine: morning audiences with officials, afternoon poetry sessions with his male favorites, evening private time that the records delicately refer to as imperial rest. The boys were given ranks, stipends, and living quarters based on their level of favor. Some received silk robes worth more than a provincial governor's annual salary. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. This wasn't about Saga's personal preferences. This was about power and control. The boys came from specific families, carefully selected. Their presence in the palace created obligations, debts, and leverage. A family with a son in imperial favor gained influence. A family whose son fell from favor lost everything. Saga had created a system where noble families competed to offer him their children. The court officials had to witness this. They had to participate in ceremonies honoring these boy concubines. They had to write poetry praising their beauty. They had to attend formal presentations where new favorites were introduced. And they had to pretend this was all perfectly normal, part of refined court culture, aesthetic appreciation of youth and beauty. One record describes a banquet where Emperor Saga publicly praised a 14-year-old boy named Takami for his skill at dance. The boy performed wearing layers of silk that court observers noted cost more than most samurai earned in a lifetime. After the performance, Saga presented Takami with a jade pendant that had belonged to his own father. The court had to applaud. They had to compose poems celebrating the moment. They had to act like they were witnessing imperial generosity, rather than watching a middle-aged man publicly claim ownership of a child. The system worked because everyone was complicit. The boys' families accepted payment and prestige. The court officials wrote the poetry and kept the records. The Buddhist priests blessed the arrangements. The palace staff maintained the special quarters and provided whatever the emperor required. Nobody could claim ignorance. Nobody could pretend they didn't know what was happening in those private chambers every night. Emperor Saga ruled for 14 years. During that time, over 300 boys passed through his collection. Some stayed for years. Others disappeared after months. The records note arrivals but rarely mention departures. The boys simply vanished from the documents, replaced by new names, new descriptions of beauty and grace, new family connections to exploit. When Saga abdicated in 823 to become a Buddhist monk, which was customary for retired emperors, he took 12 of his favorites with him to his private temple. The court records note this transfer with the same administrative language used for moving furniture. 12 human beings, the oldest barely 20 years old, were relocated like imperial property because that's exactly what they were. But this wasn't about one emperor's twisted preferences. This was about establishing a template. Saga had proven that the imperial system could accommodate and institutionalize the systematic exploitation of children. He had shown that with enough ceremony, enough poetry, enough pretense of refinement, the court would accept anything. He had created the infrastructure that future emperors would use and expand for the next 1,000 years. The truly horrifying part is that Saga is remembered as one of Japan's great cultural emperors. He promoted literature, supported the arts, established educational institutions. History books praise his contributions to Japanese culture. They mention his reduction of the female harem as evidence of his restraint and wisdom. They rarely mention what he did instead. They definitely don't talk about the 300 boys. But the imperial household archives contain the truth. Saga's personal diaries survived, sealed and forgotten, until modern historians gained access. In his own words, written in classical Chinese that only educated elites could read, he described his acquisitions with the same language a collector uses for rare objects. He rated them, compared them, discussed their qualities and deficiencies. He wrote about breaking in the resistant ones, about training them to please him, about the satisfaction of complete possession. One entry from 817, describing a 13-year-old named Yukimaro, contains a sentence that reveals everything. His tears make the victory sweeter. This wasn't about affection or even desire. This was about power so absolute that resistance itself became entertainment. The system Saga created lasted until 1868. That's over 1,000 years of institutional abuse operating at the highest level of Japanese society, hidden behind poetry and ceremony, protected by the divine status of the emperor, enabled by every single person who chose to look away. And here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. This wasn't the exception. This was the foundation. Everything that came after, every expansion of the system, every new horror that would unfold in imperial chambers, it all started with Saga's decision to replace women with boys, and the court's decision to let him. But what Saga established was just the beginning. He created the demand. Other people would perfect the supply. The Fujiwara clan controlled Japan for over 400 years, not through military power but through a different kind of strategy. They placed their daughters as imperial consorts, their sons as regents, and their influence in every level of government. They were masters of political marriages and strategic alliances. When Emperor Saga created his system of male favorites, the Fujiwara saw opportunity. By 850 CE, less than 30 years after Saga's death, the Fujiwara had established what palace insiders called the alternative gate. While other noble families still competed to place daughters in the imperial harem, the Fujiwara began systematically supplying boys. They had figured out what other clans were too proud or too stupid to understand. Access was access, regardless of gender. Fujiwara no Yoshifusa, who became regent in 858, maintained detailed private records that his family preserved for centuries. These documents, hidden in a family storehouse and only revealed after World War II, describe the operation with business-like efficiency. The Fujiwara didn't just send their own sons. They recruited boys from subordinate families, purchased attractive children from impoverished nobles, and even acquired boys from wealthy merchant families desperate for aristocratic connections. The selection process was systematic and brutal. Fujiwara agents would visit allied families with sons between ages 10 and 14. They called these visits cultural assessments. In reality, they were inspections. The boys would be examined for physical attractiveness, health, and temperament. Those who passed the initial screening would be taken to a Fujiwara estate for further evaluation. One survivor's account exists, written decades later by a man named Kanamori, who had been recruited at age 11. He described being stripped naked in a room with 5 other boys, while Fujiwara officials walked around them, discussing their qualities like farmers evaluating livestock. They checked teeth, examined skin for blemishes, measured proportions. They made the boys walk, turn, kneel, stand in various positions. The evaluation lasted 3 hours. 4 boys were selected. 2 were sent home. Kanamori never saw those rejected boys again, and later learned they had committed suicide from the shame of being returned. The boys who passed faced months of preparation. The Fujiwara maintained special training houses in Kyoto where selected children underwent transformation. They learned court etiquette, classical poetry, music, and dance. They were taught how to move gracefully, how to speak softly, how to lower their eyes submissively. They received instruction in serving tea, arranging flowers, and playing instruments. Everything was designed to make them appealing to imperial tastes. But the real training happened at night. Older boys, veterans of imperial service who had been returned to Fujiwara control, would teach the new recruits what would be expected of them. Kanamori's account describes these sessions with devastating clarity. The training wasn't theoretical, it was practical, physical, and traumatic. Boys who resisted or showed reluctance faced punishment, beatings, starvation, isolation in dark rooms. The message was clear. Compliance was survival. The families who provided these boys received substantial compensation. A son accepted into imperial service brought immediate benefits, tax exemptions, appointments to government positions, preferential treatment in legal disputes. One Fujiwara ledger from 891 lists payments made to families, 50 bolts of silk, 200 measures of rice, and a minor provincial post for one boy. That was the standard rate for an average candidate. Exceptional boys brought higher prices. Some families saw this as an opportunity. They specifically raised sons for this purpose, training them from early childhood in music and poetry, keeping them indoors to maintain pale skin that aristocrats prized. These families treated their boys like crops to be cultivated and harvested when they reached optimal value. Other families were simply desperate. Impoverished nobility with no other way to regain status would offer sons to the Fujiwara, hoping imperial favor might restore family fortunes. The boys themselves had no choice. In one case, a 12-year-old named Yasunori tried to run away the night before his presentation to the emperor. Fujiwara guards caught him within hours. The punishment was public and deliberate. Yasunori was brought before the other trainees and beaten until he couldn't stand. Then they dressed him in his presentation robes and delivered him to the palace anyway, bruised and terrified, as an example to the others. The emperor accepted him. Yasunori served for 3 years before his name disappeared from all records. The presentation ceremonies themselves were elaborate affairs. Selected boys would be dressed in specially designed robes that managed to be both formal and revealing. They wore makeup that made them appear younger, their faces painted white in the style reserved for imperial consorts. Their hair was arranged in complex styles that took hours to complete. Then they would be brought before the emperor during private audiences, where other court officials would also be present, watching, evaluating. The boys had to perform. They would dance, recite poetry, play music, demonstrate their training. The emperor and his close advisors would discuss the boys' qualities while they stood there, unable to speak, reduced to objects for evaluation. If the emperor showed interest, the boy would be accepted into imperial service immediately. If not, he would be returned to the Fujiwara, his value diminished, his future uncertain. Palace records from the 10th century show that the system had become so institutionalized that the Imperial Household Bureau maintained official budgets for male favorites. There were line items for clothing, housing, education, and something ominously listed as personal services training. The bureaucracy of abuse had its own accounting system. The financial arrangements were complex. The Fujiwara paid families for boys, then presented them to the emperor as gifts, which created obligation and debt. The emperor provided the Fujiwara with influence and appointments, which funded the acquisition of more boys. It was a closed loop of exploitation where everyone profited except the boys themselves. One document describes what happened to boys who entered imperial service. They lived in special quarters called the Seiryoden, the emperor's private residential complex. They had ranks and titles that sounded official but were really just markers of ownership. Junior Companion 4th rank meant you were new and unproven. Senior Companion 2nd rank meant you had pleased the emperor enough to be kept longer. 1st rank meant you were a primary favorite, which sounded like success, but was actually the most dangerous position because the emperor's attention was most intense. These boys existed in a strange limbo. They had status above most court officials but no real power. They wore expensive clothes but owned nothing. They lived in palace luxury but couldn't leave. They were treated with formal respect in public and used however the emperor wished in private. Some adapted and found ways to survive. Others broke completely. The turnover was constant. Boys arrived, served, and disappeared with mechanical regularity. The Fujiwara records track this with cold efficiency. Between 850 and 950 CE, over 2,000 boys passed through the Fujiwara recruitment system. The palace records account for maybe 40% of them during their service years. After that, the boys simply vanish from history. Where did they go? That question would haunt researchers for centuries. But palace insiders at the time knew. They understood that imperial service had an expiration date, usually around age 20, when boys lost the youthful appearance that emperors prized. What happened then wasn't discussed in official records. It didn't need to be. But here's what makes this especially disturbing. This wasn't happening in secret. Court nobles knew. Buddhist priests knew. Government officials knew. Foreign visitors from China and Korea wrote about it in their diplomatic reports. Everyone understood that the Fujiwara clan was running a supply operation providing children to the emperor, and nobody stopped it because everyone benefited from maintaining good relations with imperial power. The system worked so well that other clans started copying it. By the late 10th century, at least 4 major families were operating similar recruitment networks. Competition increased, which meant younger boys, better training, more elaborate presentations. The market for imperial favorites had become so established that families began specializing. Some focused on musical talent, others on physical beauty, some on intellectual accomplishments. They were differentiating their products. One particularly disturbing record from 967 describes a presentation where 3 different families each brought multiple boys, creating what was essentially an auction. The emperor spent an afternoon evaluating candidates while advisors discussed their relative merits. The entire proceeding was recorded with the same language used for selecting horses or hawks, comparing bloodlines and training, discussing which family had produced the superior product. The boys who were selected that day, all between 12 and 14 years old, were immediately moved into imperial quarters. The boys who weren't selected were returned to their families in disgrace. 2 of the rejected boys killed themselves within a week. Their families treated these suicides as shameful failures rather than tragedies. This was the system Emperor Saga had created and the Fujiwara had perfected, an institutional mechanism for acquiring and exploiting children, wrapped in ceremony and culture, protected by imperial authority, and funded by the most powerful families in Japan. It ran with the efficiency of any successful business because that's exactly what it was. But recruitment and training were just the beginning. Once inside the palace walls, these boys discovered they had been sold into something far worse than they could have imagined. The palace walls weren't protection. They were a cage. Boys who entered the Seiryoden discovered this within hours of arrival. The special quarters for imperial favorites occupied an isolated section of the palace complex, connected to the emperor's private chambers by a covered walkway that servants called the Passage of Tears. New arrivals learned why it had that name very quickly. A boy named Michitaka, who somehow survived long enough to write a secret memoir decades later, described his first night in detail. He was 13 years old, had been praised for his musical ability, and genuinely believed he was entering palace service to play the koto for the emperor. His family had celebrated his selection as a great honor. They had been paid handsomely. They had dressed him in expensive robes and sent him off with blessings and pride. The first thing that happened when Michitaka entered the Seiryoden was that older boys stripped him naked. They bathed him with cold water and rough cloths that scraped his skin. They inspected every part of his body, checking for any imperfections the initial screening might have missed. Then they brought him to a senior attendant, a man in his 30s who had once been an imperial favorite himself, who explained the actual rules. There were no music lessons scheduled. Michitaka's koto had been taken away. He would practice only when the emperor specifically requested entertainment. His real training would focus on other skills. The senior attendant used clinical language to describe what would be expected, what the emperor preferred, what techniques Michitaka needed to learn. The explanation lasted 20 minutes. Michitaka vomited twice during it. The training system was brutally efficient. New boys were assigned to veterans who had already served the emperor for years. These mentor favorites taught techniques, positions, methods of pleasing imperial tastes. The training wasn't gentle or gradual, it was immediate and practical. Boys who showed reluctance or fear faced consequences designed to break resistance quickly. Palace records mention a training regimen, but use vague administrative language. Preparation for imperial service. Instruction in court protocols. Cultivation of appropriate demeanor. One document preserved in the archives lists supplies for the training quarters, medicinal herbs for pain, various oils and unguents, restraint devices described as positioning aids, and something listed as correction implements. The correction implements were whips, canes, and iron restraints. Michitaka's memoir describes watching a 12-year-old boy named Takahiro being beaten for refusing to cooperate with training. The punishment happened in front of all the other boys as an educational demonstration. Takahiro was tied to a wooden frame and struck 30 times, while the senior attendant explained that resistance was not only futile, but would make everything worse. After the beating, Takahiro was immediately forced to continue his training. He complied. They all learned to comply. The psychological manipulation was systematic. Boys were kept isolated from each other, except during training sessions. They weren't allowed to form friendships or provide each other comfort. The only relationships permitted were with their training mentors, creating a twisted dependency where the same person inflicting trauma became the only source of any human connection. Sleep deprivation was common. Boys would be woken multiple times during the night for practice sessions, or simply to reinforce that they had no control over their own time or bodies. Meals were irregular and sometimes withheld entirely as punishment for perceived failures. The goal was to create complete psychological dependency and eliminate any sense of autonomy. One particularly cruel technique involved forced competition between boys. The training mentors would compare their students, praising some while humiliating others, creating a hierarchy where boys competed for slightly better treatment. This prevented any solidarity or collective resistance. Boys who had been tortured together would turn on each other for tiny advantages, attacking perceived rivals, reporting each other's failures to the mentors. The palace kept detailed performance records. Each boy had a file tracking his progress in various skills, his compliance level, his emotional stability. These evaluations determined how quickly a boy would be presented to the emperor. High performers might enter imperial service within weeks. Slow learners could spend months in training, enduring repeated sessions until they met standards. But here's where the system revealed its true cruelty. The training period, as horrific as it was, represented a kind of limbo where boys still maintained some shred of hope. They told themselves they just needed to get through the preparation, that actual service might be different, that they might find ways to survive or even gain favor. The mentors encouraged this thinking. They promised that compliant boys would be rewarded, that the emperor could be generous to favorites who pleased him, that there were paths to survival and possibly even freedom. These were lies. The mentors knew it. The system knew it. But the lies kept boys compliant during training, which was all that mattered. Michitaka's memoir describes the day he completed training. A senior palace official examined him, asked him to demonstrate various skills, and declared him ready for imperial service. Michitaka felt relief. The worst was over. He had survived the preparation. He had no idea that he had just graduated from hell's waiting room into hell itself. The presentation ceremony was elaborate. Boys completing training were dressed in special robes, their hair arranged in complex styles, their faces painted. They were taught specific ways to walk, to kneel, to lower their eyes. Everything was choreographed to emphasize submission and availability. Then they would be brought before the emperor during evening audiences. These presentations happened regularly, usually once or twice per month when new boys finished training. The emperor would receive them in his private chambers with only a few close advisors present. The boys would perform, play music, recite poetry, demonstrate their training. The emperor would watch, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply observing. Then he would make selections, Boys who were selected that night would remain in the imperial chambers. Boys who weren't selected would return to the training quarters to continue preparation. Being rejected at presentation meant more training, more abuse, more months of hell before another chance. Some boys were presented multiple times before finally being selected. Others were never selected and simply disappeared from the records. For boys who were accepted, the reality of imperial service began immediately. Michitaka described being chosen along with 2 other boys on his first presentation night. The emperor dismissed his advisors. The doors closed, and Michitaka discovered that everything he had endured during training had been preparation for systematic nightly abuse that would continue for years. The palace maintained a rotation system. The emperor had favorites he preferred, but he also expected variety. New boys were used frequently at first, then cycled into regular rotation with the others. Palace staff maintained schedules coordinating which boys would attend the emperor on which nights. The system ran with bureaucratic efficiency. Boys lived in constant anxiety. They never knew when they would be summoned. Attendance was mandatory and immediate. Refusal wasn't an option. Boys who became sick or injured were expected to serve anyway, unless they were literally unable to move. The emperor's pleasure took absolute priority over everything, including the physical and mental health of the boys providing it. The isolation was complete. Boys in imperial service had no contact with their families. Letters were forbidden. Visits were impossible. The families had been paid, the transaction completed. The boys belonged to the emperor now, and the emperor didn't share. Some boys adapted by mentally detaching. They learned to separate their consciousness from what was happening to their bodies, to retreat into internal spaces where the abuse couldn't fully reach them. Others broke completely, losing coherent thought, becoming empty shells that performed, required functions while their minds collapsed inward. The palace staff documented this deterioration with the same clinical detachment they applied to everything else. Medical records note boys suffering from various ailments, chronic pain, digestive problems, infections, and something described as melancholic disorder, which was their term for severe depression and psychological breakdown. Treatment was minimal and focused solely on keeping boys functional enough to continue serving. Suicide attempts were common. Boys would try to hang themselves, poison themselves, or simply refuse to eat until they died. The palace had protocols for handling this. Guards monitored the boys constantly. Potential suicide risks were restrained at night. Boys who attempted suicide were punished severely before being returned to service, the logic being that pain from punishment was better than death and would discourage future attempts. Michitaka's memoir mentions a boy named Sadayuki who tried to kill himself 3 times in 2 months. After the 3rd attempt, palace officials decided Sadayuki was too much trouble. He disappeared from the quarters one night. The other boys were told he had been reassigned to provincial service. Nobody believed it. They understood what had actually happened. The truly devastating part was that this horror had no defined endpoint. Training had been finite. Survive it and move forward. Imperial service was indefinite. Boys served until the emperor grew tired of them, or until they aged out of imperial preference. That could take years. Some boys served for 5 years or more before being discarded. 5 years of nightly abuse, constant terror, complete isolation, and psychological destruction. And here's what nobody wanted to acknowledge. This wasn't the emperor acting alone. The entire palace infrastructure supported this system. Hundreds of officials, guards, servants, and administrators participated in maintaining the operation. They scheduled the boys, maintained the quarters, provided medical care to keep them functional, handled discipline problems, and documented everything with meticulous bureaucratic precision. The Imperial Household Bureau had an entire department managing the logistics of imperial favorites. They had budgets, staff hierarchies, operational procedures. Abuse had been fully bureaucratized, turned into routine administrative work that employed dozens of people, whose job descriptions included facilitating the systematic exploitation of children. Some boys found tiny ways to survive. They formed secret friendships despite prohibitions, whispering to each other in darkness, providing moments of human connection in an environment designed to eliminate humanity. They developed small rituals and coping mechanisms, counting specific numbers, reciting poetry silently, focusing on tiny details to maintain some thread of sanity. But these survival strategies only delayed the inevitable. The system was designed to break them. It just took different amounts of time for different boys. Strong ones might last years before finally shattering. Fragile ones broke within months. But they all broke eventually because nobody could withstand years of systematic dehumanization while maintaining psychological integrity. Palace records from the period 950–1050 CE, when the system reached its peak efficiency, track hundreds of boys through the training and service cycle. The documents note arrivals, training completion, imperial service assignments, and medical treatments. They track performance ratings and behavioral problems. They document everything except what actually mattered, the complete psychological and physical destruction of children. Michitaka survived 6 years of imperial service before being discarded at age 19. His memoir, written decades later when he was a broken old man living in a Buddhist monastery, ends with a sentence that captures the true horror. "I learned to smile while dying inside, and that skill kept me alive long enough to discover that survival was worse than death." But as terrible as the training and service were, boys who endured them still clung to a desperate hope that someday it would end, that they might eventually age out of imperial preference and be released. They had no idea that the system had already decided their fate, and freedom was never part of the plan. The palace called it completion of service. The boys who survived long enough to reach their late teens or early 20s learned to dread those words. Because completion didn't mean freedom. It meant being transferred to the next stage of a carefully designed system that ensured used favorites could never threaten imperial dignity by revealing what they had experienced. Emperor Daigo, who ruled from 897 to 930, was particularly systematic about handling boys who aged out of his preference. Palace records from his reign show a detailed disposal protocol. When a boy reached approximately 20 years old, or when the emperor simply grew tired of him, palace officials would conduct an evaluation. This assessment determined the boy's fate based on several factors: his family connections, his potential to cause embarrassment, and his psychological state. Boys from powerful families received preferential treatment, relatively speaking. They would be given minor appointments in provincial administration, sent far from the capital where they couldn't cause problems, but could still function in society. These boys understood they were being exiled, their silence purchased with barely livable stipends, and the implicit threat that speaking about their experiences would destroy whatever minimal position they had been granted. One such case was documented in the private archives of the Minamoto clan. A distant cousin named Yoshisada had entered imperial service at age 13 and served for 7 years. When he aged out at 20, he was appointed as a junior official in a remote northern province. The appointment came with explicit instructions. He was never to return to Kyoto, never to attend court functions, never to write about his time in palace service. Yoshisada obeyed. He lived until 48, dying alone in rural obscurity, his existence forgotten by everyone except archivists tracking noble family lineages. But boys from less influential families faced much darker fates. Palace records use euphemistic language to describe their disposals: transferred to temple service, assigned to special duties, retired from active roster. These phrases appeared in documents with bureaucratic regularity. What they actually meant took decades of research to fully understand. The temple service designation was the most common. Boys who couldn't be safely released into society were sent to remote monasteries, supposedly to live as monks. Palace records show hundreds of such transfers during the 10th and 11th centuries. For years, historians assumed this meant former favorites were being given spiritual retreats to recover from their ordeals. The reality was considerably worse. These weren't ordinary monasteries. They were specialized facilities, essentially prisons disguised as religious institutions, located in isolated mountain regions, far from any population centers. The monasteries received generous imperial funding in exchange for accepting transfer boys, and ensuring they never returned to society. What happened to boys in these facilities remained hidden until modern researchers gained access to monastery archives in the 20th century. A 1954 study of records from Mount Hiei Monastery, one of the primary receiving institutions, revealed the truth. The monk designation for transferred boys was fictional. They weren't ordained. They weren't educated in Buddhist doctrine. They were confined to isolated compounds, forbidden from interacting with actual monks, kept under constant supervision by guards who reported to palace officials, not monastery leadership. These boys lived in conditions that ranged from harsh to actively cruel. They performed manual labor, farming, construction, maintenance work. They received minimal food, inadequate clothing, and no medical care beyond what was necessary to keep them functional. They were essentially enslaved, hidden away where they couldn't embarrass the imperial court or reveal what they had experienced. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Some of these monastery prisons served another purpose. They acted as storage facilities for boys who might be recalled to palace service. If an emperor developed nostalgia for a former favorite, the monastery would send the boy back. Palace records show this happened regularly. Boys who thought they had finally escaped imperial service would be dragged back to Kyoto years later, forced to resume serving an emperor who wanted to relive past preferences. One record describes a boy named Takaaki, who was sent to temple service at age 21, recalled at 23 for 6 months of renewed imperial service, returned to the monastery, then recalled again at 25. He was finally released from this cycle at 27, by which point he had completely lost his sanity. The monastery records note he spent his final years rocking silently in a corner, unresponsive to any stimulation, his mind completely broken by repeated cycles of abuse and false hope. The boys who couldn't be safely warehoused in monasteries, either because they were too psychologically damaged or because they posed too great a security risk, faced the darkest fate of all. Palace records describe these cases with chilling brevity. Administrative resolution, final disposition, removed from active registry. One document from 968, discovered in a sealed section of the Imperial Archives, contains a list of 17 boys who received final disposition in a single month. The list includes their names, ages, ranging from 18 to 23, and a brief note explaining the decision. Subject demonstrated unstable temperament and persistent resistance to acceptable standards. The document includes no information about what happened to these boys after their final disposition. They simply vanished from all records. Modern historians have theories. Some believe these boys were executed quietly, their bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace. Others suggest they were sold to private brothels or criminal organizations, which would explain their complete disappearance from official records. The truth likely includes both possibilities and others too dark to contemplate. What's certain is that these boys ceased to exist in any documentary form, which in a bureaucracy as meticulous as Imperial Japan means they were deliberately erased. But some boys managed to survive the disposal process and even found ways to escape the monastery prisons. These cases were rare and typically ended badly. A collection of arrest records from various provinces during the 11th century show multiple cases of young men in their 20s being captured and returned to monastery facilities after escape attempts. The punishments for escape were severe and public, designed to discourage others from trying. One case from 1034 describes a former favorite named Motohira, who escaped from a mountain monastery, made it to a coastal town, and attempted to board a ship heading to China. He was captured just before departure. The arrest record notes he was carrying documents describing his experiences in palace service, apparently hoping to sell his story to foreign courts. Motohira was returned to the monastery. The record notes his subsequent punishment lasted 3 days. After that, there are no further mentions of Motohira in any documents. The few boys who successfully escaped and managed to survive in society faced different horrors. They couldn't reveal their backgrounds without inviting immediate arrest and return to monastery prisons. They couldn't seek help from families who had sold them and wanted to forget the transaction. They had no legal identity beyond their status as imperial property. They were ghosts, non-persons trying to build lives from nothing while hiding the trauma that defined them. Michitaka, whose memoir provides the most detailed survivor account, described his disposal at age 19. He was sent to a monastery on Mount Koya, where he spent 8 years doing forced labor while slowly regaining some psychological stability. He eventually escaped by faking his own death during a winter avalanche, then fled south to Kyushu using a stolen identity. He lived the rest of his life in constant fear of being recognized and returned, never staying in one place long, never forming lasting relationships, always ready to run. His memoir, written in his 60s while living as a hermit, describes the fate of boys he knew in palace service. Of the 23 boys he could name from his cohort, he knew of 3 who received provincial appointments and disappeared into obscurity. He knew of 14 who were sent to temple service and never heard from again. He knew of 2 who committed suicide rather than face disposal. The remaining 4 simply vanished without any notation in records he could access. But here's what really reveals the system's true nature. The palace kept precise records of boys entering service: names, family backgrounds, physical descriptions, training progress, service assignments. The documentation was meticulous, but records of boys leaving service was sparse, vague, and often contradictory. The system carefully tracked its acquisitions but deliberately obscured its disposals. This wasn't accidental. This was designed. The palace wanted clear documentation of boys entering service for administrative and legal purposes, but they wanted minimal documentation of boys leaving service because that's when the real crimes became undeniable. As long as the disposals remained vague and untracked, the system could maintain plausible deniability about what happened to boys who aged out of imperial preference. Emperor Go-Ichijo, who ruled from 1016 to 1036, took this obfuscation to new levels. His administration implemented a policy called graduated release, which sounded humane, but was actually more sinister. Boys would be slowly transitioned out of palace service over months or even years, during which time their documentation would be gradually altered and eventually deleted from active records. By the time a boy fully exited the system, he had been administratively erased, leaving no trail to follow. This policy meant that nobody, including the boys themselves, knew their official status at any given moment. Some boys thought they had been released only to be suddenly recalled months later. Others believed they were still in active service when they were actually being prepared for disposal. The confusion and uncertainty prevented any organized resistance or public exposure because the victims themselves couldn't clearly articulate what was happening to them. The psychological impact of this disposal system was devastating. Boys who had survived years of abuse while clinging to hope of eventual freedom discovered that freedom was illusory. They would either be exiled to obscurity, with their silence purchased through threats, imprisoned in monastery facilities that served as holding cells for imperial mistakes, or simply erased from existence through means the palace preferred not to document. Some boys went insane waiting for disposal. Palace medical records note cases of boys suffering complete psychological breakdowns between the time they aged out of imperial preference and the time they received disposal assignments. The waiting period, which could last weeks or months, became a special kind of torture where boys knew something terrible was coming, but couldn't predict what form it would take. And here's the ultimate cruelty. The system convinced some boys that disposal was their own fault. Palace officials would tell them they were being transferred because of behavioral problems or insufficient gratitude for the honor of imperial service. The boys internalized this blame, believing they had failed rather than recognizing they had been systematically destroyed. But the palace made one critical mistake. They assumed that boys who were disposed of would be too broken, too isolated, or too terrified to ever tell their stories. They assumed the combination of threat, shame, and trauma would ensure permanent silence. They were almost right. Almost, but not quite. Because the monastery prison system, designed to hide disposed boys away forever, actually concentrated survivors in locations where they could eventually meet, share experiences, and recognize that they weren't alone. And that recognition, decades later, would lead to the discovery of something the palace had worked very hard to keep buried. Mount Hiei Monastery, sat in the mountains northeast of Kyoto, one of the most sacred sites in Japanese Buddhism. Thousands of monks studied there over the centuries. Pilgrims visited to pray. Emperors donated fortunes to maintain its temples. And hidden in a remote section of the complex, behind walls that regular monks never crossed, was a compound that held the empire's darkest secret. By 1150, over 300 former imperial favorites had been transferred to Mount Hiei's special facility. They ranged in age from late teens to early 40s, representing generations of disposed boys who had somehow survived long enough to be warehoused. The monastery kept them separated from the main complex, confined to a walled compound with its own sleeping quarters, work areas, and supervision system. Guards monitored them constantly. They weren't allowed visitors. They received no correspondence. They existed in administrative limbo, neither free nor officially imprisoned, just stored away like damaged goods nobody wanted but couldn't risk releasing. The palace assumed these boys were too broken to pose any threat. Years of abuse had shattered them psychologically. Isolation prevented any organization. Constant supervision eliminated opportunities for collective action. The system had been operating for over 3 centuries without any significant resistance. The assumption was that it would continue indefinitely. That assumption was wrong. A man named Arihito, who had entered imperial service at 13 and been transferred to Mount Hiei at 22, spent his first 5 years in the compound exactly as the palace intended. Working, surviving, saying nothing. But Arihito had something most of the others lacked. He could read and write with exceptional skill, talents that had originally brought him to imperial attention. During his years at the monastery, he began secretly documenting everything: names of boys in the compound, their ages when they entered imperial service, how long they had served, what they knew about the system. Arihito hid his writings in a hollowed space beneath the floorboards of the sleeping quarters. Over 5 years, he compiled a record of 187 boys currently in the compound and another 93 who had died there. He noted patterns. The average age at entry was 12.7 years. The average length of imperial service was 6.3 years, and the average survival time after transfer was less than 8 years. Most boys died from disease, suicide, or what the monastery records vaguely called accidents. But Arihito did something more dangerous than just documenting. He began sharing information with other survivors, carefully selecting those who seemed psychologically stable enough to process what he was compiling. He found 23 men willing to discuss their experiences, to compare stories, to recognize the patterns. What emerged from these quiet conversations was a collective understanding that they weren't individual victims of personal misfortune. They were products of a deliberate, systematic operation that had destroyed thousands of boys over centuries. This recognition changed everything. Individual trauma is isolating. Collective trauma can become rage. The men began meeting in small groups during work periods, using hand signals and brief whispered exchanges to coordinate. They weren't planning escape. Escape was pointless when they had no legal identity and nowhere to go. They were planning something much more dangerous: exposure. The opportunity came in 1156 during the Hogan Rebellion, a succession dispute that threw Kyoto into brief civil war. During the chaos, monastery security loosened as guards were pulled away for military service. Arihito and a small group of co-conspirators saw their chance. They didn't try to flee. Instead, they broke into the monastery's administrative building and stole records, logs of transfers from the palace, financial documents showing imperial payments to the monastery, correspondence between monastery officials and palace administrators. The stolen documents proved everything. They showed the monastery prison system was officially sanctioned and imperially funded. They included names and numbers, how many boys had been transferred, how much the palace paid per boy, what happened to boys who died in custody. The records were bureaucratic proof of institutionalized abuse spanning centuries. But Arihito and his group faced a problem. They had evidence, but no way to publicize it. The imperial government controlled all official communications. Buddhist authorities answered to imperial power. Local officials were appointed by the court. There was no independent press, no public forum, no mechanism for exposing imperial crimes without immediately being arrested and silenced. So they made a desperate decision. They would take their evidence directly to the imperial palace during a public ceremony, expose the system in front of as many witnesses as possible, and accept that doing so would likely mean their deaths. It was suicide with a purpose. Make the crime so public that even imperial power couldn't completely suppress it. The plan was simple and terrible. During the 1157 New Year celebrations, when the palace hosted thousands of nobles, officials, and foreign dignitaries, Arihito's group would infiltrate the public ceremonies. They would wait until the emperor appeared before the assembled crowd, then reveal themselves, present their evidence, and testify about their experiences before being inevitably killed. The goal wasn't survival. It was creating a scene so dramatic that witnesses would remember and talk about it despite official attempts at suppression. They almost succeeded. On New Year's morning, 1157, 6 men from Mount Hiei made it into the palace grounds by disguising themselves as servants. They carried the stolen documents hidden in their robes. They positioned themselves near the main ceremonial hall where Emperor Go Shirakawa would receive formal greetings from his court. But palace security was more thorough than they anticipated. Guards conducting routine inspections found the documents. Within minutes, all 6 men were arrested. They were dragged away before the emperor even appeared, before they could say a single word publicly. Their careful planning, their evidence, their willingness to die for exposure, all failed in an instant of bad timing. The palace response was swift and brutal. The 6 men were interrogated under torture for 3 days. Palace officials wanted to know if others were involved, if more evidence existed, if the conspiracy extended beyond the monastery. The men revealed nothing. They endured torture and said nothing, protecting the others at Mount He who had helped compile the information. On the 4th day, all 6 were executed. The method was designed to send a message. They were burned alive in the palace courtyard, their bodies reduced to ash that was scattered rather than buried. The palace wanted to ensure there were no graves, no martyrs, no physical evidence these men had ever existed. The stolen documents were destroyed. The monastery at Mount Hiei received increased security and stricter supervision. Guards at the compound were doubled. New policies prohibited any gatherings of more than 3 confined men at a time. The palace had identified a threat and responded with systematic suppression. But here's what the palace didn't know. Arihito hadn't been among the 6 men arrested. He had stayed at Mount Hiei, deliberately not participating in the final operation, despite being its architect. The group had decided someone needed to survive to continue documenting, to preserve the evidence, even if the exposure attempt failed. After the executions, Arihito resumed his quiet work. He continued recording information, now with even more careful secrecy. He expanded his documentation to include the failed rebellion itself, who had participated, how the palace had responded, what had been lost. He hid these records in multiple locations throughout the compound, ensuring that if one cache was discovered, others would survive. Arihito lived another 22 years, dying at age 49 in 1179. In his final months, as illness consumed him, he completed a comprehensive account of everything he had witnessed and documented. He wrote in classical Chinese, using sophisticated language that would be accessible to educated readers but incomprehensible to the guards who monitored the compound. He hid this final document in the most secure location he could devise, sealed in a wooden box, wrapped in waterproof cloth, buried beneath the foundation of a storage building that had just been constructed. His final written words were a message to an unknown future reader. I have recorded the truth that power tried to erase. If you find this, know that thousands of boys suffered and died in the service of imperial pleasure. Know that we tried to expose it and failed. Know that the silence was enforced by execution. Let this stand as testimony that we existed, that we suffered, and that we tried to make it stop. Arihito died believing his documentation would never be found, that his years of secret record-keeping had been a futile gesture against overwhelming power. He died thinking the system had won completely, that the truth would remain buried forever along with the bodies of all the boys who had been destroyed by imperial service. He was wrong, but he would never know it. The palace thought they had suppressed the rebellion completely. They had executed the conspirators, destroyed the evidence, tightened security at the monasteries. They had eliminated the immediate threat, but they had also inadvertently confirmed something crucial. The system could be exposed, evidence existed, and survivors were willing to die trying to reveal the truth. Over the following decades, small acts of resistance continued. Boys in the compound found subtle ways to document their experiences despite increased surveillance. They scratched names into walls, buried small caches of written accounts, passed information to sympathetic monks who occasionally entered the compound. None of these efforts produced immediate results. The palace remained secure. The system continued operating. But every hidden document, every scratched name, every buried account was a seed planted against an uncertain future. The men who created these records had no realistic hope they would ever be discovered. They did it anyway because the alternative was allowing their suffering to vanish completely into official silence. The final cruel irony is that the palace's own meticulous documentation habits eventually contributed to their exposure. Imperial bureaucrats kept records of everything, including their payments to monasteries, their transfers of disposed boys, their security responses to threats. They preserved these documents because bureaucracies preserve documents. They filed them away in sealed archives, thinking sealed meant secret. But sealed only means secret until someone breaks the seal. And time has a way of breaking things that power thought were permanent. The system continued operating for another 7 centuries after the failed 1157 rebellion. Thousands more boys passed through imperial service, were disposed of through various mechanisms, and disappeared into the bureaucratic void. The palace refined its methods, tightened security, improved its suppression techniques. The system became even more efficient at destroying children and hiding the evidence. But all systems eventually end, and when this one finally collapsed, the truth it had worked so hard to bury would emerge in ways the palace never anticipated, revealing horrors that even the surviving documents could barely capture. Everything changed in 1868. The Meiji Restoration overthrew the old imperial system and brought Japan into the modern era. Western influences flooded the country. New laws, new governments, new attitudes about transparency and accountability. The divine emperor system that had enabled centuries of abuse was restructured and limited. For the first time in Japanese history, imperial archives became theoretically accessible to researchers and historians. Theoretically. The reality was more complicated. The new Meiji government had no interest in exposing scandals that would damage imperial prestige during a critical transition period. The archives were technically open, but access was restricted, documents were selectively available, and anything too embarrassing remained sealed under various pretexts. The Imperial Household Agency, which managed the archives, became expert at controlling information while maintaining an appearance of transparency. But some documents slipped through. In 1873, a young government clerk named Kurosawa Takeshi was cataloging records from the old palace administration when he found something disturbing. Financial ledgers showing regular payments to various monasteries, listed under Special Facilities Management. The amounts were substantial and had continued for centuries. Kurosawa started investigating what these payments were for. He traced the paper trail through administrative records, monastery correspondence, and transfer documents. What he discovered made him physically ill. The system of imperial favorites, the monastery prisons, the disposal protocols, all documented in meticulous bureaucratic detail spanning over 800 years. Kurosawa compiled a report describing his findings and submitted it to his superiors, believing this historical abuse should be publicly acknowledged. His report disappeared immediately. Kurosawa was transferred to a remote rural post. Official records show he died 2 years later in an accident, though his family always suspected murder. His compiled research vanished from government files. The Imperial Household Agency issued a directive that the specific documents Kurosawa had found were to be reclassified and sealed indefinitely for preservation purposes. But Kurosawa had made copies. Before submitting his official report, he had transcribed key documents and hidden them with a trusted friend who worked at a Buddhist temple. These copies survived, passed down through temple archives, forgotten but preserved. Over the following decades, bits of information leaked out. Historians researching other topics would stumble across references to imperial companions or special service boys in peripheral documents. Monastery records mentioned transfer payments without explaining what they were for. Family genealogies occasionally noted sons who entered palace service and never returned. The fragments existed, scattered across hundreds of archives, but nobody connected them into a coherent picture. The breakthrough came in 1954. A team of historians studying Heian period court culture gained access to previously sealed sections of several monastery archives. At Mount Hiei, during inventory of a storage building scheduled for demolition, workers discovered a wooden box sealed beneath the foundation. Inside was Arihito's comprehensive account, remarkably preserved after 775 years. The document was unlike anything historians had seen. It wasn't vague or euphemistic. It was detailed, specific, and brutal. Arihito had named names, described practices, included dates and locations. He had documented the training system, the disposal protocols, the monastery prisons. He had compiled statistics, estimates of how many boys had passed through imperial service, how many had been sent to monastery facilities, how many had simply disappeared. The historians who found the document were stunned. This wasn't peripheral historical curiosity. This was evidence of systematic abuse operating at the highest level of Japanese society for nearly a millennium. They brought their findings to academic authorities, expecting serious scholarly attention and possibly public acknowledgement. Instead, they faced pressure to suppress everything. The Imperial Household Agency moved quickly to confiscate Arihito's account, claiming it needed authentication and preservation. Academic institutions received informal suggestions that publishing research on this topic might jeopardize their government funding. Historians who tried to pursue the subject found archives suddenly closed for reorganization, or documents declared too fragile for examination. But the scholars had already made copies, and some were determined to reveal the truth regardless of consequences. In 1957, a small academic press published a monograph titled Systems of Imperial Service in Medieval Japan that carefully documented the male favorite system using available evidence. The publication caused immediate controversy. The government didn't ban the book outright, which would have attracted too much attention. Instead, they used softer suppression. The publisher faced sudden tax audits. Distributors declined to carry the book. Libraries mysteriously never received their orders. The book existed, but was effectively unavailable to the general public. Then in 1962, something happened that the government couldn't suppress. Workers excavating the site of a former palace garden in Kyoto, preparing the ground for a modern building, discovered human remains. Lots of them. The initial dig revealed 47 skeletal remains buried in irregular graves, without markers or coffins. Archaeological analysis determined they were all male, mostly adolescent or young adult, buried sometime between the 10th and 12th centuries. The discovery made news because the location was significant. Palace grounds. The developer had to halt construction while archaeologists properly excavated the site. Over the following months, the dig expanded as more remains were found. The final count was 183 individual skeletons, all male, ages ranging from approximately 12 to 25 years old, buried in what appeared to be a mass disposal site. Forensic analysis revealed disturbing details. Many skeletons showed signs of malnutrition and disease. Some had healed fractures consistent with abuse. Several showed evidence of violent death, crushed skulls, broken neck vertebrae, blade marks on bones. One cluster of 23 skeletons had been buried at the same time, suggesting mass execution. The archaeological report was careful and professional, noting facts without speculation. But journalists made connections. Here were nearly 200 young males buried secretly on palace grounds during the exact period when historical documents described an imperial favorite system. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The Imperial Household Agency issued a statement claiming the remains were probably servants who died during a plague outbreak and were buried hastily. This explanation satisfied nobody. Plagues didn't produce blade marks on skulls. Servants didn't get buried in secret graves without coffins or markers, and the age and gender distribution was far too specific to be random. Public pressure forced a more thorough investigation. The government commissioned an independent study, partly to demonstrate transparency, partly to control the narrative. A team of historians, archaeologists, and forensic experts spent 3 years examining available evidence: the skeletal remains, monastery archives, palace records, and the scattered documentary evidence that had leaked out over the previous century. Their 1967 report, published in both Japanese and English, finally confirmed what researchers had known for decades. The imperial court had maintained a system of male favorites from approximately 800 CE until the mid-19th century. Thousands of boys had passed through this system. Many had been disposed of through monastery transfers, provincial exile, or methods the records didn't specify. The Kyoto burial site represented a small fraction of the total victims, boys who had died or been killed on palace grounds and were buried secretly to hide evidence. The report was carefully worded to avoid inflammatory language. It presented facts, noted patterns, and acknowledged that many details remained unknown. But the implications were clear. The Japanese imperial system had institutionalized child sexual abuse for over 1,000 years, operating with the knowledge and cooperation of the entire court apparatus. The public reaction was complicated. Many Japanese struggled to reconcile this information with cultural narratives about imperial dignity and historical greatness. Some dismissed the findings as Western-influenced attacks on traditional culture. Others demanded fuller disclosure and official accountability. The controversy raged in newspapers, academic journals, and public forums for years. The Imperial Household Agency never issued a formal apology. They acknowledged that historical practices differed from modern standards and expressed general regret for any suffering that occurred in earlier eras. This carefully non-specific language avoided admitting systematic abuse while appearing to show appropriate concern. But researchers continued digging, both literally and figuratively. Additional archaeological sites were discovered. Another burial ground near the old palace at Nara contained 89 skeletons, all young males. Excavation of the Mount Hiei monastery compound in 1973 revealed a mass grave with over 200 individuals, again all young males, buried over a period spanning several centuries. Monastery archives yielded more documentation. The Mount Koya monastery had preserved financial records showing they received 1,247 transfer boys between 1050 and 1650, and detailed what happened to them. 743 died at the facility, 284 were administratively resolved through unspecified means, 167 escaped and were recaptured, and 53 simply disappeared from all records. These numbers represented just one monastery. Similar facilities existed throughout Japan. Statistical analysis of the combined evidence produced horrifying estimates. Between 800 and 1868 CE, approximately 12,000 to 15,000 boys entered the imperial favorite system. Of those, maybe 5% survived to old age. The rest died young, were executed, committed suicide, or vanished into administrative voids. The documentary evidence for this mass destruction existed in archives across Japan, but it had been scattered, obscured, and deliberately suppressed for over a century. The most disturbing discovery came in 1981. Researchers examining newly opened sections of the Imperial Archive found the palace's own casualty reports, bureaucratic documents tracking deaths of boys in imperial service. These reports covered a 200-year period from 1450 to 1650 and recorded 2,147 deaths. The causes were listed with clinical detachment, disease, accident, suicide, administrative resolution, and a category called service complications that appeared 1,129 times. Medical historians analyzed the service complications category and determined it was euphemistic language for deaths resulting directly from sexual abuse, internal injuries, infections, bleeding complications. Over 1,000 boys had been killed by the abuse itself, and the palace had documented it with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to everything else. One document from 1584 summarized annual statistics. 47 new boys entered service, 23 boys aged out and were transferred to monasteries, 31 boys died from various causes including 14 from service complications, and 3 boys were given administrative resolution for behavioral problems. The matter-of-fact language describing industrial-scale destruction of children was perhaps more disturbing than graphic details would have been. The final revelation came in 1996 when the Imperial Household Agency, facing growing pressure for transparency, finally opened the complete archive of palace medical records. These documents, spanning centuries, included detailed notes from physicians who treated boys in imperial service. The medical descriptions were clinical and specific, documenting injuries, diseases, and chronic conditions that could only result from systematic sexual abuse. One physician's journal from the 1620s described his daily routine treating boys in the Seriodin. Morning rounds begin at dawn. Treat rectal tears, abdominal inflammation, infection of genital tissues. Provide pain remedies sufficient to allow continued service, but not so strong as to impair performance. 3 boys this month have developed internal damage severe enough to threaten mortality, but orders are to maintain their availability to His Majesty unless death becomes imminent. This doctor, whose name the archive had redacted, treated boys in imperial service for 23 years. His records document hundreds of cases. He noted their ages, their symptoms, their prognoses. He recorded deaths with the same clinical detachment he applied to everything else. He was a willing participant in systematic abuse, providing just enough medical care to keep victims functional while documenting their destruction in precise medical terminology. The accumulation of evidence by the end of the 20th century was overwhelming. The system had existed. It had operated for over a millennium. It had destroyed thousands of boys. And every level of Japanese imperial society had known, participated, and maintained systematic silence. Modern Japan still struggles with this history. The imperial household maintains that historical practices should be understood in their cultural context, rather than judged by modern standards. Conservative scholars argue that the evidence is incomplete and subject to interpretation. Nationalist groups dismiss the findings as exaggerations designed to embarrass Japanese culture. But the evidence exists. The bones exist, buried in multiple mass graves across Japan. The documents exist, preserved in archives despite centuries of attempted suppression. The monastery records exist, documenting transfers and disposals. The medical records exist, describing injuries and treatments. The statistical compilations exist, counting bodies with bureaucratic precision. And Arihito's final testimony exists, pulled from beneath a foundation after 775 years, giving voice to thousands who died silently. We existed, we suffered, we tried to make it stop. The true scope will never be fully known. Too many records were destroyed. Too many boys disappeared without documentation. Too many monasteries have lost their archives to fire, earthquake, or deliberate destruction. But the minimum estimate, based on confirmed documentary evidence and archaeological findings, is that between 12,000 and 15,000 boys were destroyed by the imperial favorite system over its 1,000-year existence. The palace that claimed divine authority, that presented itself as the moral and cultural center of Japanese civilization, that commanded absolute loyalty and reverence from its subjects, had operated an industrial-scale system of child sexual abuse for a millennium. And when that system finally ended, not because of moral awakening, but because of political revolution, the institutional response was to hide, suppress, and deny, rather than acknowledge and atone. The bones in the ground tell the story power tried to bury. The documents in archives record the truth bureaucracy tried to obscure. And the silence that still surrounds this history in many quarters demonstrates that even now, decades after exposure, Japan hasn't fully confronted the horrifying reality of what its imperial system did to children for 1,000 years. The boys who died were real. Their suffering was real. The system that destroyed them was real. And the institutions that enabled, participated in, and then tried to hide that systematic destruction were real. These aren't historical curiosities or cultural differences. These are crimes that happen to actual children, documented in their own words when possible, in bureaucratic records when not, and in the bones still emerging from the ground when all else fails. The imperial system didn't just tolerate abuse. It industrialized it, bureaucratized it, funded it, protected it, and then spent over a century trying to hide it. And the most damning evidence of all is how long that cover-up succeeded, how many people cooperated with silence, and how even today, full acknowledgement remains controversial rather than obvious. The garden where they found those first 183 skeletons is now a public park. A small monument mentions that human remains were discovered there, without explaining who they were or how they died. Tour guides don't discuss it. History textbooks barely mention the entire system. The story remains largely unknown outside academic circles. But the bones are still there, under modern buildings and parks throughout Kyoto and Nara. The documents are still there, filling miles of archive shelves. The truth is still there, waiting for anyone willing to look past institutional denial and confront what actually happened. The Imperial Court of Japan, protected by divine mythology and cultural reverence, spent 1,000 years destroying children and then spent another century hiding the evidence. They almost succeeded in erasing the victims entirely. Almost, but not quite. Because some records survived, some bones emerged, and some truth proved too heavy to stay buried forever. The ghost boys finally have testimony. It came too late to save them, but it exists. That's something. Not enough. Never enough. But something.